Hey guys. Tonight, we tumble back through the mud-caked, torchlit corridors of medieval power to meet some of the worst kings ever to grace a throne. And you probably won't survive this royal mess. Imagine waking up in a damp hut, your bed made of straw and regret, only to discover that your lord and master is a spoiled man-child who loses castles like socks and gets blackmailed into signing foundational legal documents. Welcome to the reign of King John. And yes, it's exactly as chaotic as it sounds. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You rise with the sun, but there's no golden glow of promise, just a gray sky sagging over the damp English countryside. Outside your leaky hut, the air smells like sheep, vit firewood, and faint despair. You stretch your aching limbs, squinting down the dirt road that leads to the castle, the same one John has just handed over to the French. Again, it's the year 1205, and things in the kingdom are not great. John Lackland, youngest son of Henry II, wasn't even supposed to get the throne. He was nicknamed Lackland because he had no territory, but somehow, like a medieval house cat knocking cups off the counter, he fumbled his way into ruling England. From the very start, he's the royal equivalent of that one guy in your group project who forgets to show up and still wants his name on the final presentation. His brother, Richard the Lionheart, the famous crusader with a sword and a brand deal in every direction, left John with a strong kingdom. And John well. He promptly loses Normandy, then Anjou, then Brittany. You try not to think about it too hard, because every land lost means a new tax for you. Yes, you serf, peasant, villager, taxpayer of the bottom rung. You watch as messengers ride past in a frenzy. Bearing grim news, John has raised scutage again. Scutage, the pay-to-skip war fee, is the medieval version of DLC content in a broken game. Nobles hate it. You can't even afford a comb. As the fields go unplowed and the lords grumble into their goblets, John keeps raising money for failed campaigns that go precisely nowhere, except maybe to the bottom of a soggy trench in Poitou. And then there's the matter of Arthur. Not the legendary sword guy. No, this one is Arthur of Brittany, John's teenage nephew and rival claimant to the throne. You hear whispers through the tavern beams John may have had him imprisoned. Then, maybe stabbed, or starved, or drowned. Historians still argue whether John personally ordered Arthur's murder or just conveniently left the boy in a dungeon and wandered off humming. Either way, by 1203, Arthur has vanished. Convenient? No. As the years drag on, John's paranoia grows thicker than the castle walls. You walk through a village where entire families have been imprisoned for debts. One noble has all his sons held hostage. John's signature move becomes cruelty by paperwork. No fire and brimstone, just fines, bribes, and freezing dungeons that echo with the sound of lost titles. You sneak a glance at the clergy, heads low, eyes tired. John's feud with Pope Innocent III might have begun as a petty spat over who appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury, but it escalates fast. John refuses to accept Stephen Langton. The Pope retaliates with an interdict: no church services, no sacraments, No. Weddings. You feel it. People stop getting buried properly. There's a hollow silence in town. Ghosts stack up like unpaid bills. Eventually, the Pope excommunicates John. You half expect lightning to strike the royal keep. It doesn't. John keeps eating roasted meat and fining widows. But something changes in the wind. Even nobles who once tolerated John for his grudging competence start sharpening their daggers metaphorically and literally. You trudge past barons gathering in secret. They're fed up. You hear them muttering about liberties and rights, which seems fancy. Talk for stop, charging us rent on our own land. They demand a list of rules. John refuses, until swords are unsheathed. Then he agrees. Sort of. You find yourself staring at a gathering on the banks of the Thames at Runnymede in 1215. It's muddy, confusing, and historic, though no one seems happy about it. The barons are waving a document. John's scowling like someone just watered down his wine. That parchment, the Magna Carta. Sure. It doesn't mean much for you just yet. You're still shoveling manure, but it sets something rolling. It's like the prequel to democracy. If democracy involved fewer rights and more plague, still. John signs it. Sort of. He affixes his seal, then immediately begs the Pope to annul it. The Pope obliges. War breaks out. You, of course, get taxed again. And while the chaos unfurls, John gets sick, possibly dysentery. You'll remember it as the most deserved bout of explosive gastrointestinal distress in royal history. While fleeing a rebel advance in 1216, John loses his treasure in the mudflats of the Wash. Not metaphorical treasure. Literal crown jewels. Whole carts of gold swallowed by the tide like the kingdom itself trying to erase him. You hear tales of his fevered final days, sweating, ranting, vomiting, repenting, whether he died choking on regret or roast peaches. No one's quite sure. Historians still argue whether John was more incompetent or just spectacularly unlucky. Either way, he's gone. You exhale, though your ribs still ache from last winter's famine, and your boots are just bits of stitched cloth, pretending to be footwear. But the sun peeks out for a moment. There's a new boy, King Henry III. Maybe he'll be better. I won't be. But you, peasant of England, just survived the reign of one of the most terrible kings in history. And all you got was this lousy tax increase. The sun doesn't rise so much as it slinks into the Bohemian sky, sluggish and uncertain, much like the man who's supposed to be ruling this place. You shuffle past the market stalls in Prague. Mostly empty, except for a barrel of questionable cabbage and one sleepy chicken tied to a peg. The Kingdom of Bohemia is technically part of the Holy Roman Empire. But with King Wenceslas IV on the throne, it feels more like an elaborate tavern break in the middle of a centuries-long bender. Wenceslas isn't your typical fire and brimstone tyrant. He's something stranger, a king who mostly just can't be bothered. You hear stories from castle servants of late mornings, and even later nights, of his fondness for hunting dogs and strong drink, and of hours spent doing absolutely nothing, while rebellions stew like sour soup. Historians still argue whether Wenceslas was truly incompetent or simply depressed, but either way, he treats ruling like an inconvenient job he forgot he applied for. You pass through the castle gate and spot him, slouched in a velvet chair, one boot missing, a goblet dangling from slack fingers. He stares at a stained glass window, as if waiting for it to blink. There's no council meeting today. He postponed it again. probably because it conflicted with a mid-morning nap or a roast goose emergency. Wenceslas inherits the Bohemian throne in 1378 from his father, Charles IV, a competent emperor who spent decades trying to organize the sprawling chaos of the Holy Roman Empire. His son, however, would rather feed his pet lion than attend church councils. You once saw the lion. It looked just as confused as the rest of the kingdom. You hear he was crowned king of the Romans too. Technically, the Holy Roman Emperor-to-be. But nobody seems especially eager to see that follow-through. He keeps missing key votes. Cardinals complain. His rivals maneuver. He drinks. There's an imperial golden seal, somewhere gathering dust. Meanwhile, the local nobility is getting increasingly twitchy. There's unrest in the air tension between Czech and German factions, urban elites and rural lords. Wenceslas could step in, reconcile, mediate. Instead, he cancels a planned assembly and commissions 3 new capes. You try not to judge. After all, who among us hasn't procrastinated by accessorizing? Things begin unraveling with the speed of a badly stitched tunic. In 1394, a group of Bohemian nobles straight up kidnaps the king. Yes, you heard that right. They seize their monarch and toss him into prison for months, blaming his failure to manage public order and accusing him of neglect. You'd think this would be the part where he turns things around, maybe raises an army, delivers a rousing speech, restores some order. Nope. He gets released and goes back to napping. Back in Prague, religious tension is bubbling like over-fermented ale. Reformist preachers like John Hus start drawing crowds with firebrand sermons about church corruption and local language rights. Wenceslas, in theory, supports church reform. In practice, he sends mixed signals. One month he protects the reformers. The next, he lets the bishops go wild. You've seen tighter strategy at a medieval sheepdog trial. And then there's the 1400 incident. Remember that Roman kingship title? A bunch of electors declare Wenceslas deposed. Citing negligence, they elect a new guy. Does Wenceslas go to war over it? Not really. He basically shrugs and says, "Okay, but I'm still king of Bohemia." Right? You sigh into your bowl of barley soup. It's hard to rebel against a monarch who's already surrendered half the game. Despite all this, Prague still thrives partly thanks to Charles University, partly thanks to traitors who ignore the king altogether. Wenceslas doesn't so much guide the city as hover vaguely nearby. He's the kind of ruler whose absence is more productive than his presence. Quirky tidbit. Wenceslas once tried to breed a new type of hound by crossbreeding mastiffs and greyhounds. The experiment ended with exactly one enormous dog that slept 20 hours a day and refused to chase anything, much like its owner. Back in your village, people mostly just avoid talking about politics. To the pressing, you focus on daily bread, on patching that hole in your roof with woven reeds. On the one candle, you ration for darkness. You hear that Wenceslas now spends most evenings alone in a windowless room, drinking in silence, while his advisors wander the halls, pretending he might someday respond to memos. When the Hussite Wars finally break out after his death in 1419, nobody is surprised. It's like watching a moldy haystack burst into flames after weeks of smoking quietly. Religious anger, national identity, and decades of elite mismanagement collide. Wenceslas, mercifully, doesn't have to deal with it. He dies of a heart attack or exhaustion, or mild effort, depending on the version you believe. Historians still argue whether he was truly apathetic, sickly, or just fundamentally unsuited to power. You walk through a Prague scarred by what-ifs. What if he'd acted sooner? What if he'd backed reform clearly? What if he'd just stayed awake during meetings? But the city endures, even with a king who mostly ruled from under a bearskin blanket with crumbs in his beard. You pass his statue one day, heroically posed on horseback, sword raised. It's a bit much, you think. For a man who once missed a royal audience because his favorite sausage cart arrived late, still, Bohemia remains. And you're still here, navigating the debris of noble neglect. Not every terrible king is a villain. Some are just professionally drowsy. You stand in the echoing halls of a royal palace, the marble floors shining like frozen moonlight, the mirrors tall and slightly warped, casting dizzying reflections that shift with every candle's flicker. Somewhere behind a velvet curtain, a king is weeping, not from grief, not from defeat, but because he's convinced his bones are glass, and any sudden movement might shatter him into 1,000 delicate shards. Welcome to the reign of Charles VI of France, the monarch who once forgot who he was, ran through the halls howling like a wolf, and occasionally refused to bathe because he didn't think he needed to anymore. Outside, the kingdom teeters. France, in the late 14th century, isn't doing spectacularly. The 100 Years' War is still dragging on like a party no one wanted to attend. Taxes are high. Morale is low. And the English are occasionally stealing cities like they're collecting medieval Pokémon. But inside the court, there's a different storm brewing, one that takes place inside a single man's mind. Charles VI comes to the throne young. And at first, things seem promising. He's handsome, energetic, idealistic. They call him Charles the Beloved. You pass by the courtyard during one of his early parade's trumpets. Confetti, some kind of live unicorn. Probably a heavily modified goat. But behind the dazzling spectacles, cracks begin to form. At first, it's just mood swings, bursts of fury, cold silences that chill entire rooms. Then, in 1392, something breaks. Charles suffers what might today be called a psychotic break while leading an army. He suddenly draws his sword and attacks his own men, slaying several before collapsing into unconsciousness. You hear about it days later in the tavern, as a bard mimes the king spinning in circles, eyes wild. At first, you think it's a joke? Then you hear it wasn't the last time. Over the years, the episodes worsen. Sometimes he forgets who he is. Sometimes he doesn't recognize his wife or children. And sometimes he insists he's made entirely of glass. Not metaphorically, literally. He wears reinforced clothing to avoid breaking. He won't let people touch him. Once, he sits immobile for hours because he's terrified he'll crack if he stands. Historians still argue whether Charles suffered from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or some rare neurological condition. But medieval doctors mostly recommend prayer and bleeding. Unsurprisingly, this does not help. You pass through a chamber where Charles once ordered his advisors to avoid him unless summoned. Another day, he orders the royal archives burned, then forgets he gave the order and panics when the scrolls disappear. The court becomes a theater of unease. You learn quickly not to make sudden moves in his presence, or loud noise, or suggestions. His brother, Louis of Orleans, and his cousin, John the Fearless of Burgundy, to begin fighting for control behind the scenes. You can smell civil war, simmering like cabbage stew left too long on the hearth. And then, ah yes, there's the masquerade ball. You're not there, but everyone's heard about it. The Bal des Ardents. 1393. 6 nobles, including the king, dress up as wild men in flammable costumes, soaked in resin and pitch. It's supposed to be fun, something between a dance and a medieval furry convention. But one guest, very drunk and very late, enters with a torch. Whoosh! Shouts. Screaming. 4 men burn alive. Charles survives only because a quick-thinking noblewoman smothers him with her skirts. The public is horrified. The king's madness is no longer a secret tucked behind velvet. It's center stage. Flaming and shrieking. You see it in the people's eyes. They still call him Charles the Beloved. But with the strained politeness reserved for unstable landlords, his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, tries to manage things. But the nobles use every episode as an excuse to grab more power. France becomes a tug-of-war match, and the rope is made of fragile parchment and royal delusions. And yet, in rare, lucid moments, Charles shows flickers of the man he might have been. He orders gardens planted. He plays with his children. He composes small poems about birds. One day, he asks for his old crown to be brought to him and spends an hour just looking at it, murmuring that it doesn't feel real. You can't help but feel a strange pity. For all the tyrants who scream and burn, Charles just crumbles. A man who doesn't know who he is. Trapped in a palace full of strangers, wearing masks of loyalty. You pass a tapestry being repaired, one that used to hang in his study. It depicts a lion hunting a deer. Now the lion's face has been worn away, leaving just empty thread. Later, when Paris falls into chaos and rival factions war in the streets, people say the king did nothing. And they're right. But he also couldn't. He was asleep in a hall of mirrors, waiting not for power, but for silence. His daughter, Catherine, would go on to marry Henry V of England, in a desperate attempt to unite the thrones. But Charles, he fades like fog, still technically king, but only on paper. A figurehead who wanders the gardens, muttering about the wind. The court physicians try everything. Herbal baths, pilgrimages. One even suggests leeching the madness from his spine. You see him once, just once, during a rare public outing. He looks like a ghost in silk. Eyes unfocused. Lips slightly parted. You wonder what he sees. Maybe nothing. Maybe too much. Quirky fact. At one point, Charles insists on living only in rooms with blue ceilings. Blue, he claims, keeps the evil humors away. Whether it works or not, the palace starts to look like an expensive blueberry. When he finally dies in 1422, France is in disarray. English forces control half the country. His son, Charles VII, inherits not a kingdom, but a fractured chessboard. The people barely remember what a sane monarch feels like. They just know it wasn't this. And you keep moving, one step at a time, through the detritus of royal fragility. Not all terrible kings shout. Some whisper nonsense until the world forgets how to listen. The first time you hear his name, it's in a hushed tone, half whispered over a cracked goblet in the corner of a smoky Castilian tavern, Pedro el Cruel. The speaker spits the name out like it burns his tongue. You glance toward the hearth, and pretend not to notice how the other villagers shift in their chairs. In Castile, under King Pedro de Surf, people learn early that walls have ears. And those ears report directly to the man on the throne. It's 1,350. And you're in the heart of a kingdom, laced with suspicion. The streets feel taut, like a bowstring that's never quite relaxed. Merchants keep 2 sets of books, one for business, one for inquisitors. Nobles smile too much, laugh too loudly, always glancing over their shoulders. Pedro sits at the center of it all, ruling not with steady justice, but with bursts of charm and blood. Historians still argue whether he was a reforming strongman or a sadistic opportunist. But to you, he's the reason your uncle disappeared after complaining about wheat prices. Pedro comes to the throne, young, just 15, when his father dies. And at first, the court dares to hope. He's handsome, sharp-witted, fluent in multiple languages. He likes books. He likes women. He likes a lot of women. He's betrothed to a noblewoman, Blanche of Bourbon, but quickly develops a preference for Maria de Padilla, his mistress, and possibly his one true love. You attend the whispers surrounding their triangle like a peasant soap opera. When Pedro finally marries Blanche, he ditches her 3 days later. 3. You can't even cure sausage in that time. He locks Blanche in a remote castle while he returns to Maria, claiming, depending on the week, that Blanche was unfaithful, or cursed, or possibly just inconvenient. No one's quite sure. Blanche spends the rest of her life as a political ghost, her presence acknowledged only in court gossip and occasional diplomatic insults. Some say Pedro had her poisoned. Others claim she died of grief. You suspect it was both. But Pedro's cruelty isn't just domestic. You feel it in the air. In the sharp edge of every edict nailed to the village notice post, nobles who oppose him vanish. Entire families are executed, sometimes personally, by Pedro's own hand. He keeps a long dagger beneath his robes and isn't afraid to use it. You once heard he stabbed a guest during a banquet for arriving late. Another time, a tax collector reportedly angered him and was later found nailed inside a wine barrel, minus his tongue, and yet the poor often admire him. He's known to dine with commoners. He forces corrupt officials to repay stolen funds. He imposes harsh penalties on abusive nobles. You once saw him pardon a thief for stealing bread during a famine. You saw that same thief a week later, missing 2 fingers, for allegedly lying about being hungry. The justice of Pedro is a spinning coin, flipping so fast you can't tell which side is up. His most notorious act, though, involves his own family. His half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, born of a royal mistress. To rise against him, you follow the news in Snatch's rebellion. Alliances, mercenaries pouring in from Aragon and France. Pedro calls in help from England, none other than the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, who arrives like a tank made of velvet and plague scars. Together, they defeat Henry at the Battle of Najera in 1367. You hear Pedro celebrated with a feast that included both dancing bears and live executions, sometimes simultaneously, but Edward gets sick, very sick, and soon returns to England. Pedro, left to his own devices, starts undoing everything. The moment his allies leave, he raises taxes again, arrests former supporters, and allegedly executes a noblewoman for using the wrong honorific. And then Henry returns, with a bigger army. The final confrontation takes place in 1369 at Montiel. You huddle around a fire in your village, listening as travelers bring word of Pedro's capture. He flees into a fortress, but is betrayed. Henry corners him. What happens next is the stuff of gruesome bedtime stories. Pedro is brought into a tent. There, in the flickering torchlight, he and Henry stare at one another. Two brothers. Two swords. Two sets of teeth clenched like bear traps. A fight breaks out. Some say it's a duel. Others claim it was more like a sudden brawl. One version has Henry stabbing Pedro in the face. Another has him yelling, "I am king," as he slices Pedro's neck. Historians still argue whether it was a just execution or fratricide in the heat of vengeance. Either way, Pedro is dead. Just like that, the kingdom doesn't mourn loudly. The peasants don't dance in the streets either. They just exhale. You do, too. It's like the sky unclenches. The market square smells less of fear and more of fish again. And yet, if you catch people speaking of him in oddly reverent tones, he was brutal. Yes, but didn't he bring order, they say? He hated liars. He hated traitors. He hated nobles. You realize something strange. The terrible kings often leave behind strangely loyal ghosts. Quirky tidbit. Pedro once reportedly had a gold-embroidered tent built large enough to hold an entire banquet hall, complete with a fountain of wine and a trained leopard wearing a chain of emeralds. The leopard escaped. The wine didn't last the evening. Later, as you stroll past the site where a noble's body was once displayed for treasonous thoughts, you wonder if Pedro ever truly trusted anyone, or if he ruled purely by the blade, hoping to carve loyalty from fear. He was called the cruel by his enemies, the just by his supporters. Maybe he was both. Maybe he was neither. Maybe terrible kings are just mirrors twisted, cracked, and polished with blood. The night is thick with the scent of honeyed wine, burnt feathers, and something acrid. You can't quite place, maybe wax, maybe panic. You press yourself against the wall of a grand hall, eyes wide, breath held, as courtiers scream and nobles claw at their blazing costumes. All around you, fire dances, not in hearths, not in torches, on people. A king runs past you, his face half-painted, his mind halfway gone. This is the infamous Bal des Ardents. And, if you're reading the room correctly, the French monarchy just set itself on fire, literally and metaphorically. You've just stepped into the reign of Charles VI of France again. Yes, again, because when a king manages to have two distinct breakdowns that each deserve their own spot in the annals of terrible rule, you don't argue. You light a candle and keep your distance. It's 1393, and the court is hosting what was supposed to be a jolly masquerade ball in honor of a royal remarriage. There's dancing, wine, and, as it turns out, several men in flammable costumes pretending to be wild woodland creatures. They're covered head to toe in flaxen pitch, probably to evoke mythical forest beasts, or perhaps just to tempt fate. The king, Charles VI, is one of them. You wonder if anyone hesitated when they saw His Majesty greased up like a torch and preparing to frolic. Enter the Duke of Orleans, Charles's brother, fashionably late, and carrying a torch, he swings it merrily through the air. Possibly drunk, definitely not briefed. It connects with one of the dancers. Within seconds, The room turns into a nightmare. Flames leap. People scream. Formendi in front of you, turning from nobles into smoldering ash piles in the space of a breath. The king survives, only because someone, likely the quick-witted Duchess of Berry, throws her skirts over him and smothers the flames. She doesn't even flinch when her hem catches fire. Now that's what you call nobility. Afterward, you sit in stunned silence with the rest of Paris, your ears still ringing with the screams. The gossip spreads fast. The king nearly burned alive, while pretending to be a bush. It's not a great look. Public opinion, already shaky thanks to Charles's earlier mental breakdown, crashes harder than a medieval banquet table, missing one leg. Historians still argue whether this event marked the final straw for the monarchy's public credibility, or just one more ember in a steadily growing blaze of dysfunction. Back at the palace, the aftermath is awkward. The court tries to act like nothing happened. The surviving dancers are buried quietly. Charles is whisked away to a chamber, hung with calming blue drapes and gently murmuring fountains. You hear they've brought in a woman who hums to him for hours, hoping the sound will soothe his shattered nerves. For a few days, he refuses to speak. Then he starts referring to himself as Saint George and demands a dragon be presented for slaying. No one corrects him. You catch glimpses of the court stumbling on, bruised but not broken. The Duke of Orleans tries to redirect attention by throwing an even grander feast this time, with fewer flammable accessories. The Queen, Isabeau, hosts charity events to polish the family image. Meanwhile, Charles alternates between moments of unsettling clarity and days when he refuses to eat anything that hasn't been blessed by the stars. His physicians debate the diagnosis, possession. Melancholia I even recommends rubbing crushed emeralds on his temples. It doesn't help, but it does make him sparkle. Meanwhile, the nobility starts circling like wolves. With Charles incapacitated, power fragments. You watch as his brother Louis and cousin John, the fearless of Burgundy, wrestle for control of the regency. One day, they're smiling at court. The next, someone's steward ends up mysteriously drowned in a fish pond. It's not paranoia if everyone actually is trying to poison each other. You're no scholar, but even you can sense France inching toward collapse. The 100 Years' War still drags on in the background, like a rotting tapestry no one wants to touch. English raids, torch villages. Tax collection becomes more brutal. Trade sputters. You once hear a fishmonger say, "We used to sell trout. Now we just sell rumors." He laughs. Then he cries. Despite all this, Charles continues to reign, at least in name. Whenever he has a good week, documents are signed, orders given. But you know, and the nobles know, that the real decisions are made in dark corridors by people who speak with honeyed threats. One morning, you see Charles walking the gardens, conversing earnestly with a tree. You're not sure what the tree said, but the king looks deeply offended. Quirky tidbit. During one of his lucid spells, Charles ordered an enormous mechanical lion to be built for a pageant. It roared, moved on wheels, and promptly collapsed mid-procession, injuring 3 musicians and causing 2 miscarriages. The lion was never used again. But the musicians formed a band afterward called Le Lion Brisé. What strikes you most is how normal everything tries to seem. The court continues to dress extravagantly. Balls are still thrown. Poets still compose odes about spring. But beneath the silks and perfumed handkerchiefs is a rotten pulse. People speak more cautiously. Everyone watches their backs. One noble lady starts carrying a dagger in her stocking just in case the next masquerade gets too realistic. When John the Fearless finally has Louis of Orleans assassinated in 1407, the mask slips completely. The kingdom plunges into civil war. Burgundians and Armagnacs carve up Paris with swords and bribes. You flee to the countryside for a while. There, the only kings are weather, hunger, and rats. Eventually, Charles becomes little more than a symbol, a flickering candle in a room full of wind. He outlives most of the players in this tragedy. When he finally dies in 1422, the city doesn't erupt in grief or celebration. People just nod, as if a chapter has finally, mercifully closed. You attend the funeral procession. The coffin is draped in royal blue. People throw lavender. Some whisper prayers. Others look away. Historians still debate whether Charles should be pitied, reviled, or merely pitied more. You remember the look in his eyes during one lucid afternoon. When he asked you, just you, whether birds dream of being men, you said no. He laughed. And for a moment, he was a king again. The chill in the air isn't from the weather. It's from the silence that descends every time someone says his name, Ethelred, the Unready. You hear it in your sleep like a bad nursery rhyme. Unready, unsteady, unlucky. Even his coins look confused, stamped with a sideways grin and a crooked cross. You tighten your cloak, hoping the north wind isn't carrying more Viking sails with it. Because when Aethelred's on the throne, that's always a possibility. The year is somewhere around 1002, and you're an English villager who wakes up every morning wondering if today will be the day your town is burnt down. Again, you trudge through frost-bitten grass, not toward hope, but toward mild apprehension. Ethelred is in charge, or, more accurately, Ethelred is sitting on a chair somewhere, while his advisors whisper panic into his ear. Unready, by the way, doesn't mean he forgot to set his morning alarm. It comes from unrad, meaning bad counsel or no counsel, and that's exactly how it feels. Living under his reign, like the entire country, is being managed by a committee of sleep-deprived squirrels. Historians still argue whether Ethelred himself was dim-witted or simply manipulated by the aristocratic, power-hungry crowd that surrounded him like flies on a honey cake. The Vikings don't care about internal politics. They see England like a buffet plump, divided, rich. Danish ships carve through the North Sea like blades through butter. Towns burn. Monasteries scream. You once watched a bishop throw a lit candle at a Viking longship and call it divine intervention. It wasn't. They came anyway. Ethelred's solution: bribery. Lots of it. He levies something called the Danegeld, literally. Money paid to make the Danes go away. It works about as well as paying off a raccoon to stop going through your garbage. They take the silver, thank you politely, and then come back next year with cousins. You remember the day the Danegeld was announced in your village. People were quiet. One farmer muttered, "So now we pay to be left alone." Another whispered, "We always paid. Now we just know where it's going." You contributed 2 spoons and a copper button. You never got them back. But the most infamous move Ethelred makes is in 1002, St. Brice's Day. Rumors swirl that the Danes settled in England are planning a revolt. Ethelred's answer: a kingdom-wide order to kill every Dane in the land. Women, children, even baptized Christians, even those married into English families. The bloodshed is swift, clumsy, and brutal. You hear screaming from the next town. One of your neighbors disappears. No one speaks about it. Historians still argue whether Ethelred truly believed the Danes posed an immediate threat or if he simply panicked and lashed out. Either way, it doesn't make England safer. It enrages King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, whose sister, possibly one of the victims, is said to have been murdered during the massacre. Now, the invasions grow fiercer. No more raids. This time it's conquest. You watch the tide turn slowly, like mud choking a river. Sweyn lands in force. Towns fall. Ethelred flees to Normandy in 1013. Tail between his royal legs. You hear about it days later from a merchant who laughs so hard he nearly drops his onions. The king, your king, is gone. Run off to his in-laws like a teenage boy after breaking a window. But the story doesn't end there. Sweyn dies suddenly in 1014. Possibly from a fall off a horse or maybe divine karma, depends on who's telling it. Ethelred returns to England and tries to act like nothing happened. He's welcomed with lukewarm arms. The nobles say, "Hail." But you hear, why? Back on the throne, Ethelred promises reform. He issues laws, restarts councils, frowns in public a lot. But it's too late. The seeds of collapse have already sprouted. His son Edmund Ironside tries to fight back. But after Aethelred's death in Etusin, Sixton, England quickly falls under Danish control anyway. The old house crumbles, replaced by a Viking one with sharper furniture. Quirky tidbit: Ethelred reportedly installed a fleet of royal ships to patrol the coast only to forget to pay the crews. They mutinied. Several sold the boats to the very Vikings they were meant to defend against. You once watched a group of Danish warriors rowing merrily past in a ship still bearing the English lion. They waved. And still, through all the disasters, Ethelred lives in shadowy contradiction. Was he a hopeless king, or simply crushed by the impossible tides of history? He ruled for nearly 38 years, one of the longest reigns of the Anglo-Saxon period. That's the part no one remembers. Longevity without legacy. You remember him not through speeches or victory banners, but through confusion, through the muddled proclamations that contradict each other, through the silence of empty towns and the ash floating on the wind after another Viking raid. Through the time he built a great hall in London and forgot to stock it with food. The nobles dined on boiled cloth. Toward the end of his reign, you hear Ethelred became withdrawn. He stopped making public appearances. He would sit for hours staring into the hearth, whispering prayers in Latin, even though he never really mastered the grammar. One monk claims Ethelred tried to repent for St. Hyas, Ethelred, Bryce's day, by fasting for a month. Another claims he couldn't even remember the date, and then like a fog that overstayed its welcome, he's gone. Buried at St. Paul's Cathedral, which will later be destroyed in a fire, as if history itself wants to erase the memory. You walk past the site years later and see no marker, just damp stones and pigeons. Ethelred leaves behind chaos, divided loyalties, and a son who fights desperately to reclaim what was lost. But you, humble and weary, remember the long years of hesitation, of silver wasted, of warnings ignored. You survived Ethelred not by faith or law, but by ducking. Not every terrible king screams or swings a sword. Some just wait too long to do anything at all. You squint through greasy kitchen smoke as platters of roasted goose, mead-soaked apples, and swan, stuffed with fish, arrive at a long oaken table. Every dish smells like sin and extravagance. Goblets clink. Laughter rolls out in waves. Somewhere near the high seat, a king raises his cup, not in celebration, but in something more unsettling. A toast. Yes, but behind the smile is a plan. You've just arrived at one of Christian II of Denmark's infamous banquets. And if you're not careful, your next meal might be your last. It's the early 1500s, and Denmark is trying very hard to hold together something called the Kalmar Union, a fragile Scandinavian truce that binds Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under one crown. It's supposed to promote unity, prosperity, brotherhood. Instead, it's become a group project where no one likes each other, and everyone suspects someone else is trying to take credit for the fjords. Christian II, King of Denmark, is determined to keep it intact. The problem? He's not really a diplomat. He's more of a bring everyone to a fancy dinner and then execute them kind of guy. You first hear the rumors in Stockholm. Christian's hosting a celebration, a big one. He's just secured Sweden's submission, finally crowned himself King of Sweden, and now he's going to reward the nobility with a feast. You catch glimpses of servants carrying in barrels of salted herring, wheels of cheese, and sweet almond pastries dusted with rosewater. There's music, dancing, entire halls lit with beeswax candles. Some say he even had snow brought indoors just for the aesthetic. But then comes the part no one expects: the Stockholm bloodbath. After days of merriment, with nobles still nursing hangovers and roast mutton sweats, Christian abruptly changes tone. He accuses dozens of Swedish lords, bishops, and scholars of heresy, retroactively condemned by a pliant court. Within hours, the palace courtyard becomes an execution site. You watch, numb, as over 80 people are beheaded. The air smells like iron and roses. Some are dragged from the banquet table directly to the block. Others plead innocence between blows. Christian watches from a window, sipping wine. Historians still argue whether this massacre was calculated or impulsive. Some say Christian meant to shock Sweden into submission. Others suggest he genuinely believed in rooting out heresy. You think he just couldn't stand being challenged and decided to rule with a cleaver. Back in Denmark, reactions are mixed. The nobility are nervous. The common folk whisper. Christian's reputation grows monstrous. They call him Christian the Tyrant in Sweden. But at home, he tries to rebrand. He adopts progressive reforms, strengthens the rights of peasants, protects tenants from landowners, and even flirts with early Lutheran ideas before they're cool. In one decree, he declares that all accused criminals must be tried in Danish, so they can actually understand their charges. You tip your hat to that one. But these reforms come with a price. The elite fume. The church bristles. Christian alienates the very people who could keep him on the throne. His Queen Isabella of Austria does her best to rein him in, but she's caught between a husband hungry for power and a court unraveling at the seams. Meanwhile, you witness Christian's strange obsession with a Dutch woman named Divek. She's his mistress, low-born but clever, and for years, he refuses to give her up. He builds her a house near the palace. He protects her fiercely. When she dies, suddenly likely poisoned, Christian suspects the nobility. He has her alleged killer, a nobleman named Torben Oxe, arrested and executed without trial. It's a scandal. The Pope gets involved. European courts shake their heads in dismay. Quirky tidbit. Christian once ordered the creation of a massive royal bathtub carved from a single block of granite. He used it twice, declared it too echoey, and had it filled with books instead. The books molded. Eventually, the pressure breaks. Christian is forced to abdicate in 1523. His uncle takes over as King Frederick I, and Christian flees to the Netherlands. Brooding and bitter. You'd think that would be the end of it. But no. A decade later, Christian tries to stage a comeback. He lands in Norway with a small force, trying to stir up support. You get swept up in the rumor mill he's returned. He'll burn the cities. He brought a talking bear. The bear turns out to be false. The comeback, also false. Christian is captured and imprisoned in Sonderborg Castle. And here's where things get strangely tragic. Instead of execution, they let him live under lock and key for nearly 30 years. 30 years of house arrest. You imagine him pacing the stone corridors, muttering to portraits, still convinced he'll be king again. Some say he went mad. Others say he grew wise. Once, a servant claims he spent a year trying to tame a squirrel. Another time, he insists his bed be moved exactly 3 inches each day, so he can chase the sun. You visit Sonderborg once, long after his death. The tower where he stayed still smells of salt and old parchment. One tiny window faces the sea. That's all he had. For decades, historians still debate whether Christian II was a visionary undone by cruelty or a tyrant who happened to pass a few decent laws. You think of the blood in the courtyard, then the peasant protections, then the granite bathtub. Maybe he was both. And in the end, you remember the banquet, the one that began with toasts and ended with blood. Not every terrible king storms into power with fire and sword. Some invite you to dinner first and let you toast before they take your head. The cold is already in your bones, and you're not even through the palace gates yet. Russia, in the 16th century, doesn't just freeze your fingers, it freezes your soul. Especially when you're walking into the court of a king who's rewritten the very definition of paranoia. Ivan IV, known to the world as Ivan the Terrible, but to those closest as something more complicated, waits at the center of it all like a spider in a gilded web. And you, lucky you, you're about to see what happens when a monarch weaponizes suspicion, like it's an art form. He wasn't always terrible. You hear, he was just a child, once crowned Grand Prince, at the age of 3. Then, left to be raised by scheming boyars. Russia's aristocracy, who poisoned his mother and kept him in tattered robes. Barely fed, barely educated, definitely ignored. One tale you overhear in a bathhouse has young Ivan tossing cats from palace towers. Another claims he secretly read scripture all night. Historians still argue whether Ivan's violence grew from trauma or calculation. But either way, the bruises shaped the crown before it ever touched his head. When he officially becomes Tsar of all Russes at age 16, he makes a show of it. Robes, relics, incense, and more gold than sense. You watch from a frosted crowd outside the Cathedral of the Dormition as he steps out, chin high, eyes already tired. For a moment, people cheer. Finally, a ruler who will unite the land, fix the chaos, heal the past, and for a while, it works. Ivan reforms the military, modernizes law codes, and establishes the printing press in Moscow. You even hear rumors of public education for boys. His early reign is firm but hopeful. He marries Anastasia Romanovna, a calming influence, by all accounts. And for 10 whole minutes of Russian history, things don't feel cursed. But it doesn't last. Anastasia dies, in 1560 maybe illness, maybe poison, maybe divine punishment for a kingdom built on shadows, even shatters. Something inside him cracks and stays cracked. The mild-mannered reformer becomes something else entirely. You witness the change like watching ink spread through clean water slow, then all-consuming. He begins to suspect everyone. The boyars, the clergy, his cousins, the heir itself. In 1565, he creates the Oprichnina, a parallel government, run by his own secret force. Picture a biker gang dressed like monks, mounted on black horses, their saddles embroidered with brooms and dog heads, the brooms to sweep away treason, the dogs to sniff it out. These men, the Oprichniki, roam the countryside in fur-lined terror, executing nobles, extorting landowners, and generally making the Inquisition look like a warm hug. You see their work firsthand. Whole villages accused of harboring traitors are erased. Entire families disappear overnight. You walk past a burned church in Novgorod. Its doors chained shut, with the congregation still inside. Ivan claims they were plotting with Lithuania. No evidence is ever shown. Quirky tidbit once. He reportedly dressed as a monk, entered a monastery, unannounced, and whipped the abbot for insufficient humility. The monk survived, but his kneecaps developed a weather-based twitch. You keep your head down. Of course, everyone does. In markets, people speak in riddles. In homes, windows are stuffed with cloth to muffle unintentional blasphemies. Even bread is sliced cautiously, as though it might be accused of sedition. You know a baker who renamed his dog Loyalty just to be safe. And then there's the son. Ivan has several. But the tragedy centers on the one everyone expected to inherit, the Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. Strong, educated, almost normal. Then one day in 1581, during a heated argument, possibly about the prince's pregnant wife, Ivan strikes his son in the head with his staff. Some say it was accidental. Others say the Tsar saw betrayal in a glance. Either way, the blow kills him. You hear the wailing echo from the palace corridors all the way down to the riverbank. Ivan holds his dead son's body and reportedly weeps for days. A painting later immortalizes this moment, the blood, the panic, the horror in his eyes. Historians still debate whether this was true remorse or just another layer in Ivan's tragic spiral. You think of the prince sometimes, especially when you see an empty high chair at feasts, or when the court goes unnervingly quiet at the mention of succession. The Tsar limps toward death over the next few years, worn down by guilt, disease, and possibly mercury poisoning from his own medicine cabinet. He plays with astrology charts, consults, relics, holds seances with relics of saints. You once saw him gnawing a wooden crucifix during a military briefing. The generals said nothing. When he finally dies in 1584, collapsing while playing chess, you feel a strange mix of relief and dread. On the one hand, the terror lifts. On the other, what comes next? Russia plunges into what will later be called the time of troubles. But you already feel it. The cold in your bones grows colder. The boyars re-emerge, bickering like fleas, fighting over a dead bear. The throne is vacant, fragile. Cursed, and Ivan terrible. Tragic. Ivan leaves behind a legacy soaked in contradiction. He expanded Russian territory more than any ruler before him. He strengthened autocracy. He reformed systems. And he unleashed such cruelty that even your great-grandchildren will flinch at the mention of his name. You walk past a statue of him once. It's been defaced. Someone painted tears on the stone cheeks. You wonder who did it. And why? Perhaps they mourned the boy who loved books. Or feared the man who trusted no one. Maybe both. The cradle rocks gently in the royal chamber. Swaddled in velvet and surrounded by silence. Candles flicker. A nurse hums a lullaby she barely understands. There are no coos. No royal gurgles. Just the strange stillness of a kingdom ruled by a baby who hasn't even been born yet. You lean against a column in the cold hallway of a Habsburg palace and try to make sense of it, Ladislaus the Posthumous. King of Hungary, Bohemia, and Croatia, by technicality, because the boy was born after his father died, possibly the only monarch in Europe whose career began before his first breath. The year is 1440. You trudge through a Vienna still recovering from one king's death and one queen's very complicated pregnancy. King Albert II has died unexpectedly, possibly from dysentery, possibly from divine bad timing. His wife, Elizabeth of Luxembourg, too, is pregnant. And here's where things get awkward. The royal council has already panicked and crowned someone else, Władysław III of Poland, because they assume the child won't be a boy. You know, reasonable medieval sexism. But then, surprise, it's a boy. Little Ladislaus. Posthumously named and promptly declared the rightful heir. Cue legal chaos. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth forged documents, bribed bishops, or simply bullied enough nobles to recognize her infant's claim. But either way, Ladislaus becomes king without ever lifting his own head. At this point, you think it's all overblown. After all, how much damage can a baby do? Quite a bit. Apparently, Elizabeth has the royal crown, literally stolen. Yes, physically snatched from its sacred case in St. Stephen's Cathedral and takes it with her on a nighttime escape to Hungary. There, in an absolutely bonkers twist, her supporters crown the infant Ladislaus with it while he's still in diapers. The crown doesn't fit. The priest mumbles the oath. The child sneezes. You're told it's an omen. The kingdom is now split between two kings, a Polish teenager with an army, and a literal newborn who drools on royal silk. You watch the nobility lose their minds. Civil war simmers. In taverns, people bet on which king will win. Some choose Władysław, the real king with a sword. Others choose Ladislaus, the miracle baby, protected by divine favor, and some very pushy wet nurses. And in the middle of all this, Ladislaus grows. Slowly. Protected. Sheltered. Hidden in fortified castles, while regents and advisors tear each other apart for control. He becomes the human version of a royal check passed back and forth, whispered about in council meetings, wheeled into banquets for ceremonial yawns. By the time he can walk, he's already hated by half the kingdom and adored by the other half for doing absolutely nothing. When Elizabeth dies in 1442, Ladislaus is just 2 years old. Orphaned, crowned, and exiled, he's taken to Bohemia, then to Austria. You hear his upbringing is a strange mix of cloistered isolation and royal micromanagement. Tutors drill Latin into him, like it's a cure for uncertainty. Governors argue over who gets to touch his robes. And always, the Habsburg name looms above him like a chandelier on a fraying rope. Quirky tidbit for his 7th birthday. Ladislas is gifted a miniature suit of armor, forged of real steel. It weighs more than he does. The child puts it on once, falls over, and refuses to wear it again. It is later used as a wine rack. Eventually, the regency passes to Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick doesn't let Ladislas rule. He doesn't even let him out much. The boy spends most of his youth as a glorified houseplant, watered occasionally, fussed over, admired from a distance. You hear that Ladislas once spent 3 weeks trying to escape the palace just to see a dog race. He was caught in a laundry basket. But as the years pass, the pressure builds. Hungary wants its king. Bohemia wants a ruler. The nobles are tired of waiting. And so, in 1452, Ladislas, now 12, is finally released. You watch his ceremonial re-entry into Vienna. He's tall, pale, clearly underfed, and blinking like he's never seen direct sunlight. You almost feel sorry for him. Almost, finally allowed to rule. Ladislas does what most teenagers would do, panic quietly while pretending to be in charge. He leans heavily on advisors, most notably Ulrich of Celje, a nobleman with more ambition than charm. Together, they try to balance the chaos of the Hungarian court, the demands of the Austrian princes, and the very real threat of Turkish expansion in the east. But here's the thing. Ladislas still isn't ready. A delays decisions. Avoid conflict. At one point, he nearly causes a noble revolt just by refusing to pick sides in a family feud. You attend a feast where he announces a new tax, only to revoke it 3 days later, because someone pointed out it would affect him too. Historians still debate whether Ladislas was indecisive by nature or simply paralyzed by the weight of a crown he never asked for. Then comes 1457. He's 17. He's finally starting to find his footing. People say he's maturing, maybe even ready to rule without scripts. You hear he's begun negotiating a marriage alliance. There's even talk of reforms. And then he dies. Suddenly, violently, after a short illness, rumors whirl like snowflakes in a blizzard. Poison, tuberculosis, a vengeful ghost of King Albert. The most persistent theory involves a poisoned pear. One servant claims the fruit was unusually shiny. Another says Ladislas didn't chew. You attend his funeral. There are more questions than candles. The crown sits atop the coffin, tilted slightly, as if still unsure whether it belongs there. The nobles argue in whispers even during the service. Who rules now? What happens to Hungary? To Bohemia? The kingdom mourns. Yes, but also exhales. The strange era of the posthumous king has ended, finally, messily, as all things in this region tend to, and you leave the cathedral with a sense of uneasy relief. Ladislas ruled without ever really ruling. He was a monarch, sculpted from inheritance and inertia, a symbol more than a sovereign, born into legend, died in footnotes. You look back once. The wind lifts a corner of the black velvet draped across the stone steps. Somewhere beneath it, the future shifts. Uneasily, the wind howls through the hills of Scotland, like an insult drawn out over centuries. And, You're beginning to understand why the nobles are always squinting into the distance. It's 1,292, and the crown of Scotland is dangling like a carrot over a pit trap. Enter John Balliol, the man who gets to wear the crown, only to discover it's made of thorns, sarcasm, and English strings. You rub your temples just thinking about it, because John isn't so much a king as he is a royal marionette, and the man holding the strings Edward I of England, known affectionately as Longshanks, because apparently towering over you while stealing your borders was too long to embroider. John Balliol isn't a monster. He's not a warmonger. He's not even particularly greedy. He's just tragically out of his depth. A perfectly competent noble, if you're being generous, who suddenly finds himself parachuted into a dynastic slap fight with all the subtlety of a cabbage tossed at a harp recital. Here's how it starts. King Alexander III of Scotland dies. His heir, a little girl named Margaret, who tragically dies before she can rule. This leaves Scotland in chaos. No clear successor. 13 nobles claim the throne like medieval contestants in a reality show called Scotland's Got Crown. So the Scottish nobility, clearly exhausted and out of oatcakes, invites Edward I of England to arbitrate. Bad move. Like inviting a shark to judge a swimming competition. Edward chooses John Balliol, and to no one's surprise, immediately insists that Scotland is now a vassal state. You attend the coronation, watching John's smile twitch as Edward's messengers arrive with scrolls, taxes, and the subtle hint that independence is over. The ink is barely dry on his crown certificate before Edward starts issuing demands. Troops, gold, legal appeals to be sent to English courts. John nods along, blinking like a man who just found a snake in his soup. Historians still argue whether John ever had a chance to succeed, or if he was set up from the beginning to fail. You lean toward the latter, because every time he tries to assert his authority, Edward slaps his hand away like a disobedient toddler. At one point, Balliol dares to form an alliance with France. This is known as the Auld Alliance, and Edward responds with military force because subtlety is not his love language. By 1296, it all falls apart. Edward invades. You see English troops storm Berwick-upon-Tweed, massacring thousands. A city turned into a grave in a matter of hours. The Scottish resistance is crushed, and Balliol is forced to abdicate. They strip him of his royal insignia, mockingly calling him tomb-to-barred empty coat. Even you, standing in the mud near the castle gates, to feel the humiliation from across the crowd. He's imprisoned, not executed, which is rare for the time, just shelved. Eventually, he's exiled to France, where he spends the rest of his life as a political punchline. A king who once was, and never really was, atheist quietly, like a candle that was never fully lit. Quirky tidbit legend has it that during his captivity, Balliol developed a love for gardening, particularly onions. There's an apocryphal story of him sending Edward I a single leek as a peace offering. The English king allegedly sent back a potato, which wouldn't even exist for another 2 centuries. So, probably not true, but it says something that this joke stuck harder than his entire reign. Meanwhile, back in Scotland, the humiliation curdles into fury. You start hearing new names. Andrew Morey, William Wallace. Resistance brews in taverns, in glens, in church pews. The people are done playing vassal. You stand in the background as rebel forces gather. And you feel something shift. The era of cautious petitions is over. The swords are coming out. But for Baliol, he's already a footnote. A king whose reign lasted 4 miserable years, defined by surrender, embarrassment, and the inability to say no to someone with a bigger army. Even his supporters barely mention his name now. It's as if Scotland collectively agreed to forget him out of mercy. And yet, you remember the way he stood at his coronation. Nervous, uncertain, clutching the scepter like it might explode. You remember the pity in people's eyes. You remember the quiet dignity he tried to maintain. Even as English clerks rewrote his laws and foreign flags waved over his castles. Maybe he was never meant to be king. Maybe no one truly is. But you can't help but think, wasn't there a better way to lose? You walk past a crumbling statue in a glen. It's weather-worn, moss-covered, and unlabeled. Locals call it the ghost of the empty tabard. They say if you touch it, your voice disappears for an hour. Probably nonsense. But still, you keep your distance. Because some kings shout, some bleed, and some are remembered for how quietly they vanished. It's quiet in the halls of Windsor. Too quiet for a kingdom as frayed as this. You tiptoe past tapestries that haven't been dusted in years. Past guards who stand more for ceremony than protection. In the great chamber, Henry VI is sitting again, eyes blank. Hands still. Lips not moving. You've seen wax figures more animated than this. You wave discreetly from the shadows. Nothing. The man is breathing. That's about it. Congratulations. You're living under a king who once forgot he was king for over a year. Henry VI comes to the throne in 1422 as a literal infant. His father, Henry V, the war hero of Agincourt fame, dies suddenly. And England finds itself governed by a toddler. You, naturally, assume a regency will handle things. And for a while, it does. The problem is that Henry never quite grows into the job. He's not cruel, not foolish, just chronically incapable of ruling a realm where ambition oozes from every stone. You watch as advisors like Cardinal Beaufort and the Duke of Gloucester shuffle power like cards, each hoping the baby king will grow into their image. But instead, Henry grows into a quiet, prayerful, vaguely bewildered adult who prefers Bible verses to budgets and hymns to horsemen. You hear he once spent a week pondering whether St. Paul would have approved of taxing wool exports. Still, he marries. Margaret of Anjou arrives in 1445. Fierce and French, and utterly unlike her husband. You attend the wedding feast, mostly to watch the contrast. She holds court with fire in her eyes. He blesses the soup. She wants to crush enemies. He wants to forgive them before they even misbehave. Historians still argue whether Margaret ruled through Henry, or in spite of him but to you. It's obvious who wore the embroidered trousers in that relationship. The kingdom stumbles forward. English holdings in France start slipping Normandy, Gascony. The bits of France that Henry V had practically carved into the family dinner plate, you hear muttering in taverns. Wasn't there a war we were winning? Now, you're losing towns to French counterattacks, while Henry hosts prayer vigils and debates whether the lilies on the royal crest look too aggressive. Then comes 1453. You remember that year the way a ship remembers a storm. It starts with military disaster Castillon. England's last stronghold in France collapses, and the dream of a dual Anglo-French crown evaporates. But the real disaster, the mental one, Henry breaks. He stops speaking, stops moving. For over a year, people feed him, clothe him, even change his clothes while he stares at the wall like it owes him an apology. When his son, Edward of Westminster, is born during this catatonic spell, Henry reportedly doesn't react. Some claim he once blinked twice when someone mentioned the weather. Others say, even that's optimistic. You creep through the corridors during this time, and the whole palace feels like a waiting room for a ghost. Power shifts again. The Duke of York, Richard Plantagenet, starts sniffing around for influence. Margaret tries to keep a grip on the reins. You duck under tapestries just to avoid the arguments. And so, the Wars of the Roses begin. A tug-of-war in flower form, white rose for York, red rose for Lancaster. You? Of course. I just wish someone would pick a less poetic emblem. Maybe a nice turnip. And call it a day. Henry rules on and off through this. More off than on. Every time he seems to wake up, the kingdom is further divided. Nobles are picking sides. Battles erupt. Zank, Albans, Wakefield, Towton. You hear names like Warwick the Kingmaker thrown around. Like England is auditioning monarchs instead of electing them. At one point, Henry is captured by Yorkists and held in the Tower of London. When asked how he feels, he reportedly says, "The Lord is my shepherd," which is very spiritual, but not especially helpful during a civil war. Quirky tidbit. During one of his lucid intervals, Henry supposedly tried to create a new public holiday dedicated to quiet contemplation. No feasts. No games. Just reading scripture and meditating. It lasted precisely 1 year before being replaced with a jousting tournament. In 1470, thanks to a bizarre alliance between Margaret and Warwick, Henry is briefly restored to the throne. You watch his re-coronation with the same enthusiasm you'd give to reheating week-old porridge. Even his supporters don't look convinced. He sits there smiling, distant, murmuring about shepherds again. The crown feels heavy on his head, as if the metal knows it's been here before and didn't enjoy it. But the comeback doesn't last. Edward IV of York returns from exile and crushes the Lancastrians at Tewkesbury in 1471. Margaret is captured. Her son, the heir, killed, and Henry taken back to the Tower. One night, without ceremony, Hades. The official version is natural causes, but the unofficial version whispers of a dagger, a pillow, or just a particularly aggressive accident. You'll never know. You weren't in the room. But when the bells toll, London doesn't cry. It just exhales. Henry VI was a terrible king. Not for what he did, but for what he didn't do. He didn't fight. He didn't lead. He didn't even really govern. He simply existed while others tore the world apart around him. Historians still debate whether he was mad, holy, or just hopelessly unequipped for royal life. You think of him as a man who might have been a fine monk kind, thoughtful, gentle. If only someone hadn't handed him a crown. And you keep walking. Another king gone. Another set of nobles to fight over the scraps. The war isn't over. Not yet. But something in the air has shifted. A quiet voice has gone silent. And in its place, the roar of ambition. Louder than ever. The velvet drapes in the palace sway gently in the breeze, perfumed with rose oil and dust. You're lingering at the edge of a courtyard, recital harp strumming. Poets reciting. A faintly bored falcon asleep on someone's wrist. At the center of it all, lounging with one slipper off and a goblet of wine in hand, is Richard II of England. A man whose reign feels more like a theater production than a government. The robes are lavish. The speeches are poetic. The punishments are alarmingly swift. Richard rules like a man trying to curate his own myth. If previous kings built walls and raised armies, Richard builds pageants and commissions portraits. You half expect him to burst into rhyme mid-sentence. He ascends the throne at just 10 years old, in 1377. After the death of Edward III. Once again, you brace for another underage monarch, always a bad omen, and, predictably, the real power falls to a council of nobles and his ambitious uncle, John of Gaunt. Still, there's promise in him at first. You're there in 1381. Peeking over a wall in London during the Peasants' Revolt, thousands of commoners, sick of taxes and corruption, storm the city. They burn buildings. They execute officials. And here comes Richard, only 14, riding out to meet them. He speaks to the rebels directly, promises reforms, and miraculously calms the crowd. Wat Tyler, their leader, is suddenly cut down during negotiations. And Richard boldly declares, "I am your captain now." The moment is electric, and then he executes almost everyone involved. Historians still argue whether Richard was brave or merely shrewd. But to you, it's the first sign of something deeper, a king who sees mercy as performance and vengeance as policy. Over time, Richard grows more extravagant, more insulated, more fond of flattery. He surrounds himself with a glittering inner circle favorites who whisper praises into his ears and build monuments in his name. You see statues go up, poems commissioned. Even the royal cook starts naming pastries after him. The pear of Plantagenet is a triumph, but the custard crowns are a disaster. Richard becomes obsessed with symbolism and divine right. He starts dressing in white and gold, demanding courtiers bow to his image on coins. You attend a feast where he orders everyone to remain silent while he walks in, just so they can absorb the gravity of his presence. A jester coughs and is immediately dismissed from court. You never see him again. Then comes 1386. Parliament, tired of being treated like extras in Richard's play, demands change. They strip his favorites of power, a group of nobles, called the Lords Appellant, Zeitze control. For a while, Richard is sidelined, humiliated. He agrees to reforms, under pressure. But Richard never forgets. He waits, plots, smiles politely while scribbling mental revenge lists in invisible ink. In 1389, he regains control. The Lords Appellant grow complacent. You hear him call it the long game. Over the next decade, Richard builds a stronger, more autocratic monarchy. He taxes without consent, exiles those who once defied him. In 1397, he finally strikes. Trials, executions. One noble has his lands seized and his head taken hours later. Another is sent to die in Ireland. Richard calls it cleansing the rot. You call it personal housekeeping. You remember one moment vividly. A nobleman dragged through the court, accused of treason, forced to kneel before a golden chair. Richard doesn't yell. He just leans forward and whispers, "You forgot who I am." It's the soft ones that sting. Quirky tidbit. Richard once ordered an entire field planted with white lilies to spell his initials. Visible only from the castle tower. It took 3 years. Required 15 gardeners. And caused 3 minor floods. The lilies bloomed for 2 weeks. The field was then trampled during a poorly timed boar hunt. By 1399. Things. Spiral. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, returns from exile while Richard is away in Ireland. Bolingbroke claims he just wants his inheritance. But you and everyone else know better. With startling speed, noblesse defect, castles fall. By the time Richard returns, it's over. He's captured without much of a fight, brought back in chains, publicly humiliated. You see him led through London, his golden cloak replaced with something dull and damp. He abdicates. Parliament declares Henry IV king. Richard is imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. Historians still debate what happened next. Some say he starved. Others say he was murdered. A few even whisper he escaped and lived in secret as a gardener in Scotland. You doubt that? Gardening doesn't seem like his style. You remember Richard not as a tyrant. Exactly. But as someone who believed his kingship was art, and everyone else kept messing up the aesthetic, he wanted to be admired. Adored. Obeyed but never questioned. And when the applause didn't come fast enough, he turned on the audience. The monarchy recovers. Sort of. But you can still feel the echo of his reign every time a king asks to be called divine. Every time gold outweighs grain. Every time a ruler confuses performance for power, and you walk past a fountain he once built dry now, choked with ivy. At its base, an inscription still lingers, barely legible. Thus passes the glory of the world. Though I remain, you scoff, then glance over your shoulder. Just in case. A dry wind sweeps over sun-bleached stone as you cross the dusty courtyard of Jerusalem. Your sandals crunching over fragments of old spears and older bones. The city pulses with tension mosques and churches side by side. Pilgrims, muttering in every language you've ever heard, and a few you haven't. Above them all, carried in a shaded litter, like some grim monument to defiance, reads Baldwin de Fer, King of Jerusalem. You've heard the rumors. Everyone has, that he rules a holy kingdom with rotten fingers. That beneath the gilded armor, his flesh betrays him. That he wears gloves in summer not for fashion, but because his nerves are dying. The year is 1174, and you're in the heart of the Crusader states. That odd patchwork of European ambition and local blood. Baldwin is crowned young, just 13, and from the start, things are complicated. He's been diagnosed with leprosy, and not the maybe it'll go away if we use enough basil kind. Real leprosy. The kind that will rob him of movement, sensation, dignity. And yet here he is, riding, ruling, shaming, his face pale beneath the crown, but his eyes fierce. You stand at the back of a crowd once, as he addresses the court. His voice steady, his hands hidden in silk. You expect a puppet king. Instead, you get a fighter. Against all odds, Baldwin proves politically sharp. He navigates between warring barons, keeps the Templars and Hospitallers from tearing each other's beards out, and even manages to contain the ambitions of his own relatives, which in Crusader politics is like juggling flaming swords while someone tries to poison your soup. But Baldwin doesn't just sit in council chambers. No, You watch him ride into battle more than once. Despite the numbness in his limbs, despite the agony that comes with every jolt in the saddle, he leads troops at Montgisard in 1177, where his smaller force trounces Saladin's army. The miracle echoes through the Holy Land. People call him the Leper King, but they whisper it with awe. Now, even his enemies admit the boy has guts. Still, time is cruel. You see the disease progress. One year, he's walking with a cane. The next, he's being lifted into his chair. His fingers curl in unnatural directions. His feet need to be bandaged before boots can be forced on, yet he never steps down. He delegates when he must, appoints regents wisely, but clings to the throne with a quiet, unyielding resolve. The politics grow nastier. There's Reynaud of Châtillon, the nobleman, who's less knight and more licensed chaos generator, parades caravan during peace treaties, then shrugs. When diplomatic fallout ensues, there's Guy of Lusignan, Baldwin's brother-in-law and possible heir, who somehow manages to look bewildered even when not speaking. And then there's Saladin calm, calculating, growing stronger. With every year, you hear his name like thunder beyond the horizon. Baldwin sees what's coming. He knows he's dying. In an act of strategic desperation, he tries to exclude Guy from succession, fearing the man will undo everything. He even names his nephew, Baldwin V, a child, as co-king. Hoping to stall the inevitable, you attend the dual coronation, two fragile kings, one disintegrating and one too young to read. The crowd cheers with forced enthusiasm, but you can smell the anxiety in the incense smoke. By 1185, Baldwin IV is nearly gone. Blind, weak, his body no longer listens, and yet he still receives ambassadors, still signs decrees, still demands updates from the front. He dies quietly in Jerusalem, wrapped in linens, the crown placed beside his head. Not on it. You help carry the casket, just one of many silent, sweating figures, pushing against history. Historians still debate how much power he truly held during his last years, whether he shaped the kingdom or was simply its symbol. But you, who walked beside his litter, who watched him bleed into the battlefield sand and then ask for scripture, you know, he ruled, fully, terribly. Quirky tidbit. Baldwin once requested a mechanical clock be built for the Citadel Tower, one that chimed the hour with different musical tones for each prayer time. It mostly worked, until a pigeon nested in the bell chamber and set off 3 days of false alarms. He reportedly called it a holy distraction. After his death, the kingdom of Jerusalem begins to unravel. Saladin presses harder. Internal divisions grow. The Battle of Hattin looms in the near future like a thundercloud. Baldwin's carefully stitched piece begins to fray at the seams the moment his grip is gone. And you remain in the city, watching as pilgrims continue to arrive, touching the walls as if holiness alone can protect them. You walk past the citadel and pause beneath the shadow of Baldwin's statue, erected after his death by a grieving generation. It shows him seated, armored, one hand raised, no sword, no staff, just a quiet gesture of command. His face is serene, unlined. The sculptor took liberties, but you remember the real king, the one whose flesh failed, but whose will never did. The one who ruled while unraveling, who gave everything and asked nothing except that the kingdom hold together one day longer. Not every terrible king is weak. Some are simply cursed by fate, by illness, by the impossible geometry of power. It starts, as these things often do, with a love story gone off the rails. You're standing in a Frankish chapel in the mid-800s, watching the nobles of Lotharingia fidget through another ceremony that no one really believes will fix anything. In the middle of it all is Lothair II, king of a kingdom, wedged awkwardly between bigger, meaner siblings. He's handsome enough. His crown sits straight. But the only thing truly legendary about this man is his terrible taste in marital decision-making. Because tonight's bedtime tragedy, it's not about war. It's about divorce. And everyone is going to pay for it. Lothair II is married to Tutberga, a noblewoman of respectable background, diplomatic usefulness, and exactly zero chill for what's coming next. Their union, arranged for political convenience, turns cold faster than a wet stone floor. Lothair doesn't love her. What he does love is his mistress, Waldrada, a noblewoman with sharp features, sharper ambitions, and enough influence to set royal tapestries aflame from across the room. And so begins the plot. Lothar wants out of his marriage. Not just a quiet annulment. No, he wants a cosmic do-over, complete with church approval, public shame, and enough canonical chaos to make a medieval theologian cry into his psalter. The trouble is, this isn't just personal. It's political, spiritual, dynastic. Divorce in the 9th century isn't like ghosting someone on parchment. It involves trials, tribunals, sacred relics, and very possibly a cold plunge in holy water. So Lothair accuses Teutberga of incest. Yes, incest. With her own brother. You blink slowly. Surely that's a clerical error. It is not. The accusation is as brutal as it is strategic. He figures, if the church is disgusted enough, they'll dissolve the marriage. Teutberga, to her credit, refuses to go quietly. She counters the charge, demands a trial, and then volunteers. Volunteers for an ordeal. You're there on the day of the trial. The ordeal is a hot iron one. She's forced to carry red-hot metal in her bare hands as divine judgment. The idea is simple. If God thinks she's innocent, her burns will miraculously heal. She walks across the hall, hands trembling, face calm. Weeks later, when the wounds begin to close, people begin to whisper, maybe she's telling the truth. Maybe this is a mistake. But Lothair isn't giving up. He appeals to sympathetic bishops. They hold a council. They annul the marriage. E Maris Waldrada. A private ceremony. Some flowers. Probably a few sour-faced monks in the back. You think it's over. It's not, because Pope Nicholas I gets involved. And Nicholas is not amused. He overturns the annulment, declares Teutberga the rightful queen, excommunicates the bishops who sided with Lothair. You hear the royal scribes groan as another papal bull arrives, freshly inked and heavy with judgment. The Frankish nobility is split. Some support the king, others support the pope. You hear one noble mutter, "At this point, I'd rather marry a turnip and be done with it." Lothair flip-flops. Reinstattes Teutberga. Then tries to annul again. Then flips again. This goes on for years. You begin to suspect that no one, not even Lothair, remembers who he's technically married to. Waldrada fades into the shadows. Teutberga, bruised but unbroken, clutches her status like a war banner. Historians still argue whether Lothair's obsession was about love, lust, or simply control. You think it was ego? A king who couldn't accept being told no by a church that wielded more power than his crown ever could. Because here's the real twist. Lothair's kingdom starts to crumble under the weight of this personal drama. Alliances falter. Nobles revolt. Morale drops. When your monarch spends a decade fighting over whom he's allowed to sleep with, the borders tend to become flexible. Quirky tidbit in the middle of this chaos. Lothair commissions a set of ceremonial marriage tokens, small gold medallions with his image on one side, and a pair of clasped hands on the other. No one is sure whether they were for Waldrada or Teutberga. You once saw a juggler using them as weights in a foot race. In 869, Lothair dies unexpectedly during a campaign. Dysentery, most likely, though a few whisper divine retribution. The kingdom falls into dispute. Without a legitimate heir, his territory is carved up by neighboring rulers like a particularly disappointing pie. Teutberga retires quietly to a convent. Waldrada disappears from record, and the whole scandal becomes a cautionary tale whispered to young nobles over watery ale. Never fight the Pope, and never pick a mistress with long-term plans. You visit his tomb once. It's cracked, overgrown with moss. No statues, no lingering pilgrims. Just a name, a legacy of royal melodrama that echoed into church law for centuries. Because Lothair's failure wasn't just personal, it dragged church and state into a wrestling match that left bruises for generations. And you leave the chapel shaking your head, wondering what might have happened if Lothair had simply learned to live with his vows, or if he'd chosen Waldrada and stayed excommunicated, or if, and this is radical, and he just talked it out like a grown man, instead of turning theology into tabloid. But this is the Middle Ages, where kings rule not by wisdom, but by whims, and the fallout lasts longer than their marriages ever did. The mud squelches beneath your boots with the unpleasant slurp of a kingdom unraveling. And all around you, the voices of angry men rise like a swarm of wasps. You clutch your cloak tighter and duck behind a leaning fence post. The rain tastes of iron. Welcome to 12th century England, where the roads are broken, the laws are blurred, and the King Stephen of Blois is trying his best, which, as it turns out, is not quite good enough. Stephen shouldn't have been king. You can feel that truth in your bones the first time you see him, pacing before his coronation as if hoping someone will give him a reason not to go through with it. The rightful heir was supposed to be Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I. She had a claim, a following, and a whole imperial attitude about the whole thing. But she was a woman, and medieval barons, bless them, could barely stomach the idea of a queen regnant. So when Henry dies suddenly in 1135, after reportedly eating too many lampreys, which is a very specific and unfortunate way to go, Stephen makes his move. You watch as he races to London, charms the bishops, and gets himself crowned in record time. He promises stability, peace, loyalty to the church, and for a few minutes, England breathes easy. Then everything explodes. Because Matilda doesn't sit quietly. She gathers allies, including the dangerous and magnetic Robert of Gloucester. Civil war erupts almost immediately. You hear different names for it. The anarchy, the 19-year winter, but you just call it Tuesday. 1 week. Your village is under Stephen's protection. The next, Matilda's forces ride through and torch the granary. You've taken to hiding your cheese in a hollow tree. Stephen is not a monster. He's not cruel. He's just indecisive. One day he pardons a rebel baron. The next, he arrests him again. His alliances shift like sand. His policies are soggy parchment. You hear a joke at a tavern. What does Stephen say when he enters a room? Did I come in here for something? The laughter is strained. In 1141, everything comes to a head. Stephen is captured in battle at Lincoln. Yes, the king. Personally, and imprisoned. Matilda marches to London. You expect her coronation. Instead, you get chaos. Her arrogance alienates the city. Nobles refuse to support her. A riot breaks out. She flees. Then Stephen is released. And it all starts again. You walk through ruined towns, stepping over broken siege equipment and empty wine barrels. Every castle is now a fortress. Every noble is now a warlord. Law collapses. Justice becomes a joke. Local lords mint their own coins and build private prisons. One baron near York reportedly kidnapped a bishop and held him in an iron cage suspended over a pigsty. The pigs were not amused. And still, Stephen reigns. Technically, he wins battles, loses others, crowns his son Eustace as heir, then uncrowns him, then recrowns him. You watch him pace council chambers like a man trying to remember where he left the crown. Historians still argue whether Stephen lacked conviction or was simply overwhelmed by a country that didn't want to be ruled anymore. You think maybe he just needed a nap. Quirky tidbit. During a brief truce, Stephen reportedly tried to host a tournament to boost morale. It rained for 6 days. One knight drowned in his armor. The pies went moldy. The only winner was a dog that stole a roast swan and escaped to Wales. In 1153, after nearly 2 decades of this, Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, future Henry II, arrives in England with an army. You hold your breath. Another round of war, another soggy coronation, but this time, something strange happens. Stephen, tired, broken, grieving the recent death of his beloved son Eustace, makes peace. The Treaty of Wallingford is signed. Stephen keeps the throne until his death. Then Henry will take over. You watch the king sign the parchment with a hand that trembles more from relief than age. A year later, Stephen dies. Quietly, with a prayer on his lips and maybe, just maybe, the first full night's sleep he's had in 2 decades. You attend the funeral. It's solemn, understated. The crowd whispers. No one quite knows what to say. Was he a good king? A kind man? A weak ruler? Historians still debate it. But you remember the look on his face in his final portrait, not stern, not regal, just tired. And you walk through an England beginning to heal, roads being rebuilt, castles being torn down, markets reopening. You pass through a village where someone has painted over an old wall slogan. It used to say, "God save the king." Whoever he is today, now it just says, "Let's not do that again." Not every terrible king rules with cruelty. Some simply let the country fall apart while they think it over. Again and again, the air in Evreux is thick with candle wax, wine, and the unmistakable scent of secrets. You tuck yourself into a shadowed alcove as courtiers glide past in silk and suspicion. their words sweetened with lies, their fingers stained with ink and arsenic. At the center of it all is Charles II of Navarre, charming, witty, educated, and so dangerous that even his allies sleep with daggers under their pillows. Some kings are born to rule. Charles, he was born to plot. Welcome to the poison-slicked court of the man they call Charles the Bad. He's a grandson of Louis X of France and, by his own account, should be sitting on a much grander throne. You hear him explain this at every feast, usually somewhere between the first eel pie and the fifth goblet of claret. Charles believes the French crown was stolen from him by the House of Valois, and while most people would get therapy or maybe start a politely worded letter campaign, Charles starts building a private network of assassins, spies, and freelance chemists. You know, normal stuff. In public, he's dazzling, fluent in multiple languages, dresses like he fell headfirst into a tailor's dream, witty, polished, hilarious. If you like your humor with a side of political blackmail, but beneath it all, a man who keeps poison vials behind his library books, and once allegedly had a man strangled for sneezing too loudly during a treaty discussion. The Kingdom of Navarre isn't large, but it's conveniently located, giving Charles leverage in France and Spain alike. He uses it like a dagger. You hear stories he allies with England during the 100 Years' War, then switches back to France when it suits him. 1 month he's dining with the Black Prince. The next he's pledging loyalty to Charles V. He changes sides more often than you change your socks. But the real magic, his gift for surviving, time and again. Charles gets caught forging documents, caught bribing officials, caught plotting to assassinate the French king. And each time, he slips away with a smirk and an alibi. Historians still argue whether he had compromising letters, superior, blackmail, materiel, or just really good pastries. You remember one particular scandal in 1354. Charles is accused of orchestrating the brutal murder of the Constable of France, Charles de la Cerda. His main rival for influence, the Constable is found hacked to pieces. Charles denies everything with such polished outrage that some start to believe him. Then he throws a party, with fireworks, for reasons no one understands. King John II of France doesn't buy it. He arrests Charles. You hear the story secondhand, how the king stormed into a chamber, slapped the wine from Charles's hand, and had him hauled away. For a moment, it seems like justice has arrived. And then, somehow, Charles escapes. Again, the official story involves a daring climb down a wall, a disquisite servant, and a barrel of salted pork. The unofficial story involves bribery, a priest, and some very confusing documents about land rights. Either way, he's free within months. Quirky tidbit: Charles reportedly employed a full-time alchemist whose job was to develop non-lethal poisons for interrogation. The alchemist succeeded once. The victim forgot who he was for 3 days and then tried to marry a candlestick. As the decades pass, Charles's games grow more dangerous. His shifting allegiances become harder to explain. By the 1370s, even his own nobles start to keep a healthy distance. You hear whispers in the palace doors creaking open in the night, men disappearing from banquets, the scent of bitter almonds in wine goblets left untouched. But he keeps pushing. Always one more plot, one more twist. He begins scheming to marry into more powerful houses, trying to secure succession claims in Castile and Aragon. Each time, he's blocked. Each time, retaliates quietly. Efficiently, his enemies find themselves audited into oblivion, framed for treason, or suddenly quite flammable. Yet, for all his craftiness, time catches up with him. In 1387, Charles falls ill, seriously ill. His body, once trim and quick, now aches. His skin itches. Some say it's a disease. Others believe it's the delayed result of years of self-administered preventative tonics. Still others suspect that one of his own poisons finally took offense. His doctors prescribe an unusual treatment. They wrap him head to toe in linen soaked in alcohol, then stitch the sheets together to let him sweat out the sickness. It's medieval spa logic. Relaxing, cleansing, flammable. A servant enters with a candle. No one knows if it was accident or sabotage. The flame touches the linen. Charles ignite. You hear the screams across the castle. He burns for hours before finally dying curled. Blackened. Silent. The scent lingers for days. The man who plotted the deaths of so many. Undone by one loose spark. Some call it divine justice. Others call it irony with perfect comedic timing. At his funeral, no one weeps. The nobles nod. The priests speak carefully. One even says, "He was clever," which, in this context, is less a compliment and more of a warning. The pews are full, but the silences are louder than the hymns. And you walk through the gardens he once paced, imagining new treasons. The flowers are overgrown, the paths crumbling. Somewhere, an old servant mutters, "He never stopped planning." Historians still debate Charles's legacy. Was he a political genius ahead of his time, or just a paranoid tyrant with access to a really good apothecary? You shrug. You remember the way people leaned in when he spoke, and the way they leaned back when he smiled, because some terrible kings don't need armies or wars. They just need a reason, a vial, and enough patience to wait until your wine starts to fizz. You can smell the parchment before you see it dry. Brittle, thick with ink and power. A scribe hustles past you, his arms full of scrolls, bearing seals, still warm from the wax. You peek at one and see the emblem of King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair. Don't let the nickname fool you. He's not called fair because of justice. It's his skin. Pale, smooth, almost regal in its chill. And beneath that smooth facade, a man who would bankrupt a country, strangle a church, and burn knights at the stake to balance his books. Philip rules in the early 1300s, a time when the French monarchy is still trying to convince everyone it's not just a glorified landlord. He changes that. You arrive in Paris just as his reforms begin tightening around the kingdom like a silk noose. It centralizes power, regulates the coinage, creates a bureaucracy so dense it could drown a goat. You once met a merchant who claimed he needed 7 separate permits just to import pepper. But Philip's biggest problem isn't trade, it's money. Endless wars, administrative costs, and royal bling have left the treasury gasping. He needs a solution, a quick one. So he turns his gaze to the richest targets in France, the Jewish communities, the Lombard bankers, and the Knights Templar. You hear about the expulsion of the Jews in 1306 from a fishmonger who suddenly owns a very nice house. Philip confiscates their property, cancels debts owed to them, and pockets the proceeds. It's brutal, efficient, profitable. The kingdom claps politely. Then come the Templars. You remember them, those proud warrior monks with white mantles and red crosses, veterans of the Crusades, owners of vast lands and, more importantly, vast treasure. Officially, they answer only to the Pope. But Philip's not interested in papal red tape. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307. Yes, that Friday the 13th. Philip has hundreds of Templars arrested across France. It's coordinated, sudden, surgical. You see them dragged from their beds, their temples, their altars. The charge is heresy, devil worship, spitting on the cross, kissing strange body parts during secret rituals, even sorcery. You raise an eyebrow. The accused raise their eyebrows. No one's sure what's happening, but it smells like cooked-up nonsense and torture. The trials begin, or rather, the interrogations. Under threat and fire and pain, confessions pour in like wine. Many later recant. Some die before they can. You watch one old knight stand in silence as flames lick his robe. He says nothing, not even a scream, just stares at the palace windows, as if waiting for someone inside to blink. Historians still argue whether the Templars were guilty of anything more than being inconveniently rich. But Philip isn't after guilt. He's after gold and control. The Pope at the time, Clement V, coincidentally, installed with Philip's help, eventually dissolves the order under pressure. Not because they're heretics, but to prevent further scandal, Philip's agents seize the Templar lands. The crown gets a much-needed cash injection. The remaining knights vanish. You find their swords sold off like old furniture. Quirky tidbit. Philip was once so obsessed with controlling currency that he had royal officials check the shape of coins. If they were clipped, shaved, or even slightly bent, the offender could lose a hand. One particularly unlucky merchant lost both hands for accidentally melting down a batch of coins to fix a dented chalice. Philip's final years are a legal whirlwind. He battled Pope Boniface when, who accuses him of greed and tyranny. Philip responds by sending men to rough up the Pope literally. Boniface is slapped in the face during his arrest. He dies shortly after. You pass a monk who whispers, "God watches," but he blinks slowly. And still, Philip reigns. Cold, controlled, untouched. He marries his daughter into England's royal family, builds alliances, tightens royal justice. His France is stronger than ever but colder, more regulated, less free. And then, in 1314, something cracks. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, is brought out for execution. He stands calmly before the flames. Before dying, he cries out that both Pope Clement and King Philip will soon face God's judgment, a curse. They call it Clement dies a month later. Philip gone by the end of the year. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe some oaths echo louder than fire. You walk past Notre Dame and hear pilgrims mutter prayers against greed, whispering Philip's name like a warning. His sons will reign. Briefly, Alvil de Young, the Capetian line withers. France stumbles toward chaos. And you keep walking, past empty Templar temples, past towns renamed after papal edicts, past statues of justice with cracked scales. Philip's face still appears on coins for a while, but eventually those too are melted down, made into new crowns. New lies. Not every terrible king rants or foams. Some build ledgers so clean, you don't see the blood between the lines. The wind rushes over the plain, like it's trying to stop history from happening. And you're stuck right in the middle of it, clinging to your saddle. Mud streaked across your boots, watching the royal standard of Hungary flutter at the edge of chaos. The banners are soaked, the cavalry jittery. And the king, well, the king is missing. Somewhere beneath the dust and clamor is Louis II of Hungary, last of his line. A teenager with a crown too heavy and a plan too light. You glance toward the horizon and see the Ottoman army advancing like a wave that forgot how to break. And in that moment, it's painfully clear Louis's reign is about to end with a splash. Born in 1506, Louis is crowned King of Hungary and Bohemia at the ripe age of 10. You watch as nobles squabble over who gets to advise him, who gets to control him, who gets to polish his fancy royal shoes. Hungary, once a powerhouse of Central Europe, is already cracking by the time Louis arrives. The Ottomans are pushing in from the south. The nobility is fractured into bitter factions. And young Louis, he's caught in the middle, like a nervous courtier trapped between two banquet tables during a food fight. From the start, the boy king tries. He attends councils, issues edicts, sits in long, boring meetings where people use words like succession crisis and border incursion, while Louis doodles little castles in the margins. You see him at court events, groomed, nervous, polite, but there's always that sense, that hum in the background. He's not ready. Not for this. Not for what's coming. His greatest flaw, delegation without oversight. He leaves decisions to squabbling advisors, each with their own ambitions. Taxes go uncollected. Fortresses fall into disrepair. The army scattered, underpaid, and mostly drunk. You once see a Hungarian general attempt to rally troops with a speech so uninspiring that a horse falls asleep standing up. By 1526, the Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman, the Magnificent, yes, that one is marching toward Hungary with one of the largest armies Europe has ever seen. You hear about it in taverns, on trade routes, from merchants muttering prayers into their luggage. The warning signs are everywhere. And yet, Louis waits. Historians still argue whether he truly believed he could stop them, or if he simply couldn't decide what to do. But eventually, too late, he gathers his army near the village of Mohacs. You're there on the morning of the battle, walking past cannons that haven't been tested, foot soldiers who can't find their commanders, and one knight who's still sewing his family crest onto his tunic. It's a mess, and then the Ottomans arrive. It's not a battle, it's a demolition. The Hungarian lines collapse within hours. The heavy cavalry charges, then panics, then flees. The artillery misfires. Arrows rain down like judgment. Louis, just 20 years old, finds himself in the thick of the rout. You see him riding, eyes wide, armor glittering under the storm-dark sky. He's not leading. He's escaping, and then he's gone. No one sees exactly what happens. Some say he drowned in a swamp while trying to flee. Others claim he was thrown from his horse and trampled. One version insists his own troops abandoned him. All you know is that hours later, a servant finds his lifeless body face down in a shallow brook. His golden armor glinting through the mud like treasure tossed into the wrong river. Quirky tidbit. Louis was reportedly wearing a ceremonial sword that weighed more than he did. Crafted for show, not for use. He likely never even drew it during the battle. It was later recovered, polished, and passed off to his successor, who never used it either. Just posed. The fallout is instant and catastrophic. The Hungarian throne, already precarious, shatters. The nobility splits. Some support Ferdinand of Habsburg. Others rally behind John Zapolya. Civilva erupts. The Ottomans sweep in, occupying Buda. And for the next century, Hungary is carved into pieces like a roast at a particularly grim dinner. You walk through the aftermath in silence. Mohacs becomes a watchword for failure, a national trauma. People don't talk about Louis with hatred. They talk about him like a ghost. A boy who never stood a chance. A king who rode into legend with no plan, no backup, and no exit strategy. You pass a small memorial near the battlefield. A pile of stones, Arustit Helm. A plaque that simply reads, "Here fell the kingdom." No mention of tactics. No great speeches. Just that one flat truth. You place a pebble on the mound and step back, wondering if he would have lasted longer had he just turned around. Historien debat. Louis's legacy. Some call him a victim of circumstance. Others, a symbol of everything wrong with Hungary's politics. You just remember the horse, the splash, the glittering armor vanishing beneath the reeds. Not every terrible king is cruel or mad or power-drunk. Some are just swallowed whole before they even finish their first command. The salt wind lashes your face as you peer out across the waves near the coast of Varna. The sun high and mocking in the blue above, somewhere beyond the horizon. Legends say, a king disappeared just like that. One moment, he was rallying his troops. The next, gone without a trace. You shift your weight on a rock and glance over your shoulder at the distant hills of Bulgaria. It's 1444. And you've just stepped into the foggiest chapter of Polish-Hungarian royalty, the curious case of Władysław III. The king who might have died in battle, or might have become a barefoot monk living out his days in a secret cave. Władysław comes to the throne young. Too young. That's a pattern, isn't it? You're getting used to this adolescence with scepters, nobles, with too many opinions, and one unlucky advisor trying to explain taxes using hand puppets. Władysław becomes King of Poland in 1434, and then King of Hungary 3 years later. He's crowned in Buda wearing a borrowed crown and looking faintly seasick. Everyone hopes he'll unite the two realms against the Ottomans. Instead, he grows up under the watchful eye of his advisors. A cocktail of Hungarian barons, Polish magnates, and churchmen who all want slightly different things. But Władysław is no slouch. By his late teens, he's known for piety, charisma, and a jawline that inspires love ballads. The papacy takes a shine to him. He's declared the leader of a new crusade, a holy war meant to stop Sultan Murad II, who by now has made a hobby of eating European coalitions for breakfast. The plan: march south, link up with Balkan allies, and push the Ottomans out of Europe once and for all. You can already hear the ballads. They haven't happened yet. But oh, they're ready. You're in the army as it gathers polls. Hungarians, Wallachians, knights from Burgundy, volunteers from Venice, even a few mercenaries who claim to be from England but speak suspiciously fluent. They march under Władysław's banners, white eagle, red field, gleaming crosses on every shield. The campaign starts well. Cities surrender. Bridges hold. Morale is high. Then comes Varna, the night before the battle. It rains. You sleep beneath a leaky tarp, listening to whispers in the dark. Murad is near, very near, with a massive force, likely double the size of the Crusader army. His elite janissaries are ready. His cavalry is fresh, and the terrain favorable. The Polish-Hungarian army, meanwhile, is boxed in between the Black Sea and a marsh. Great planning. The battle erupts at dawn. You see Władysław leading from the front, his armor dazzling, his white horse practically glowing. He charges like a man possessed, and for a while, it seems to work. The Ottoman left collapses. Crusader forces break through. Trumpets blare. The air smells of blood, smoke, and rosewater from a shattered perfume cart. Then Władysław makes a fatal decision. Despite advice to hold the line, he charges straight at Murad's command tent. Just rides in. Some call it bravery. Others, youthful foolishness. He's surrounded. His standard falls. A Turkish soldier reportedly cuts him down in one stroke. Or maybe it's a spear. Or maybe he trips over a dead horse. Or maybe it doesn't happen at all. Because here's the thing. Władysław's body is never found. The army panics. Without a king, it collapses. Survivors scatter into the hills, and the Ottomans secure their victory. Back home, Poland and Hungary descend into mourning. Sort of. Some refuse to believe he's dead. Murad himself reportedly had the battlefield searched for the body and came up empty. Whispers begin that he survived, fled, became a hermit, a pilgrim, a wandering mystic. In Portugal, décades later, a barefoot man, claiming to be the former king of Poland, appears in a monastery. He speaks Latin, knows royal protocol, quotes obscure scripture. Some monks believe him. Others laugh him off. Historians still argue whether the man in Portugal was really Władysław or just a clever impostor with access to the right gossip. You saw the king ride into battle. You didn't see him fall. And that silence after the charge, after the dust stays with you, like a pause in a story that never got finished. Quirky tidbit. According to later Polish legend, Władysław will return one day in the kingdom's hour of need. Like King Arthur or a very Catholic Batman, he'll rise from his hidden tomb and reclaim the crown. Some say he sleeps beneath Wawel Castle. Others say he lives among monks, sweeping cloisters and praying for forgiveness. Back in the real world, his death or disappearance leaves a vacuum. Hungary eventually falls under Habsburg rule. Poland elects new kings. The dream of crusade fades into fairy tale. The Battle of Varna becomes a cautionary tale told to every boy king who thinks glory comes from impulse. You revisit the field years later. The grass has grown back. The stones are quiet. A monument stands on a hill nearby, engraved with a name and a date. Nobody beneath it. Just wind. You close your eyes and try to picture the last charge the young king. Lance raised. Eyes fixed on something only he could see. Maybe he died. Maybe not. But you know this much. Władysław III rode into legend. not history. And legends are harder to bury. Not every terrible king is weak, cruel, or lazy. Some vanish chasing greatness and leave the kingdom behind to wonder whether that final act was courage, madness, or just a disappearing trick gone very wrong. The throne room is damp. That's the first thing you notice. The tapestries are faded, the floor uneven, and the candlelight flickers, like it's unsure whether to bother staying lit. Welcome to the court of Charles VI of France, a king whose mind unravels slowly and publicly like a bad ball of wool. You've seen bad rulers before: greedy, indecisive, bloodthirsty. But this is something else. Something keener, sadder. A kingship not marked by tyranny, but by the slow, terrifying loss of self. It begins normally enough. Charles ascends to the throne in 1380 at just 11 years old, inheriting the 100 Years' War and a mountain of debt. His uncles run things, at first levying taxes, enriching themselves, holding lavish feasts in palaces you'll never see again because they no longer exist. You drift through those early years, half listening as dukes shout and gold disappears. But by the time Charles comes of age in 1388, he seems promising, young, energetic, determined to rule on his own. He dismisses his greedy uncles and brings in a new group of reformers, his marmosets. They're called like something out of a fairy tale. For a brief moment, it looks like things might turn around. And then, in 1392, something snaps. You're there the day it happens, somewhere in the forests of Brittany. Charles is riding with his knights, when a man runs from the woods and shouts a prophecy: "Do not go further, noble king, for you are betrayed." The royal party hesitates. Charles insists. They move on. Hours later, in the baking heat, one of the pages drops a lance. It clatters. Charles turns, draws his sword, and attacks. Not an enemy. His own men. He kills one knight outright, slashes at others, raves, screams. When they finally subdue him, he collapses, eyes wide, muttering things no one understands. He doesn't remember what happened, doesn't remember days afterward. And from that point forward, the king becomes two people. On good days, Charles sits at court, signs decrees, even laughs at jokes you've heard 6 times. On bad days, he doesn't recognize his wife, or his children, or himself. He insists he is made of glass, yes, glass, and must be padded with silk so he doesn't shatter. You pass his chamber once and see a servant gently fitting cork around the legs of his chair. Historians still debate whether Charles suffered from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or some form of severe psychosis. The terms didn't exist then. All you know is that the king you once saluted now sometimes believes he's dead. And power, it doesn't vanish. It mutates. His brother, Louis of Orleans, begins to act in his name. So does Charles's cousin, the Duke of Burgundy. 2 ambitious men, circling like wolves around a wounded lion. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, tries to hold things together. You see her pacing in the corridors, issuing orders, staring down councilmen twice her size. But with no stable monarch, France fractures. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War erupts. Assassinations, propaganda, Children turned into bargaining chips. You attend a feast where everyone toasts the king, and then quietly asks if he's still eating furniture. Quirky tidbit: at one point, Charles becomes obsessed with painting everything in his chambers blue. Walls, ceiling, even the dog's collar. For a year, court scribes refer to him in private records as Leroy Blue the Blue King. Then there's the Ball of the Burning Men, a masquerade gone wrong. Charles and 5 nobles dress as wild men in flammable costumes. Torches are brought in. You don't need to guess what happens. 4. D. One survives by diving into a wine barrel. Charles watches the flames and doesn't blink. Through it all, the English invade. Again. In 1415, Henry V defeats the French at Agincourt, while Charles is locked in his room. Convinced the walls are whispering. The Treaty of Troyes follows, disinheriting Charles's own son and naming Henry V as heir to the French throne. You stand in court the day it's signed and feel the breath go out of the room. By the time Charles dies in 1422, France is barely a kingdom. The Dauphin has fled south. Paris is under English control. And the royal court is a mix of half-truths and full-time caretakers. Charles is buried quietly. No great monument, just a memory of a reign that began with promise and ended in pieces. You visit his tomb years later. The weeds are thick. The stone is plain. A child nearby asks, "Was this the mad king?" and the priest hesitates before answering. Because Charles wasn't cruel. He wasn't corrupt. He simply wasn't there. Not fully. Not enough. And in his absence, others ruled, and others tore the kingdom apart in his name. And you remember the way he once looked at the stars and tried to name them. The way he laughed before the darkness set in. The way people whispered, "Le Fol Roi, the Mad King," like a spell they were afraid to say aloud. Not every terrible king is terrible by choice. Some are just vessels into which history pours too much grief, too much pressure, and too little mercy. And now, the storm has passed. The torches have burned low. The crowns laid gently aside. You breathe out slowly, watching the flickering shadows settle into stillness, as if even history itself is finally ready to rest. These kings mad, cruel, confused, or unlucky, ruled with trembling hands and sharp-edged dreams. Some vanished without a trace. Some were swallowed by their own courts. And some simply woke each day hoping the world would make sense, only to find that power never asks if you're ready. You've wandered through crumbling castles, through the rain-slick fields of failure, and through the hush of betrayal, whispered behind velvet drapes. Their names fade now. Their mistakes soften like fog on an old battlefield. And in their place, silence returns. Peace. Perhaps, so let yourself drift. Let the sounds of swords and secrets quiet. Let the crowns fall away. Weightless now. Like dreams. You can finally set down. You're safe. You're warm. And tomorrow's history can wait. Because for now, your only kingdom is this stillness. This breath. This moment. Let it linger. Sweet dreams.